See if this works. Can everybody see that?
We can, yes. Perfect.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Jamie.
Got thumbs up in the room as well. That's great. So hello, everybody. Really nice to be here today to talk a little bit through this great HDRC webinar series. So my name's Jamie Beckett. I'm a Research Impact Officer at Coventry University. And essentially what that means is I'm part of a research services, so a research support team centralised at Coventry. I help researchers with anything regarding research impact, and we'll go into what research impact is and all of the rest of it in a moment. But just as a kind of brief overview of what I do day to day, it's really about helping researchers in the planning for research impact, delivery and monitoring of that impact within projects and other activities they're carrying out. And then once projects and other work is over, thinking about how the impact of that research can be evaluated, kind of monitored into the long term as legacy, how evidence for it can be drawn out, and also how that might feed into impact case studies for the ref, which again we'll talk about a bit more about later. So I really like my role in that it is overarching. I'm kind of working with researchers at all parts of that research process, kind of from right at the beginning of projects right to the end and beyond. And it's a really great opportunity to get an insight into different approaches researchers take. This presentation is very much from that research support perspective. So lots of the materials I'll be talking through today are things that I regularly share with researchers I'm working alongside, ways, kind of recommendations on how to approach certain things in planning for research impact, delivery, monitoring, that kind of thing. And I thought that could be of value in this context because understanding what we are recommending to researchers can be quite useful for people outside of that academic sphere, because researchers are ultimately really interested in engaging with non-academic stakeholders, whether that's councils, whether that's charities, whether it's other VCSE organisations, and to know what expectations are on academics regarding research impact can be really helpful, because I think lots of those expectations align with what could be seen as useful for organisations outside of HE as well. So let's see if I can change the slide. There we go. So today we'll really quickly go through what is research impact. Impact is one of those words which is constantly used, a real buzzword, but often it's kind of misused in different ways. So thinking about a kind of narrow definition of research impact, a working definition that can be useful to everybody here. Why research impact is important to researchers. So lots of that is in terms of funding proposals, which I know is of real interest to the HDRC, as well as the ref. Thinking about impact beyond academia, which is literally what research impact is, how that impact can be useful more broadly, conceptually, to people outside of the HE sector, really how non-HEIs, so non-higher education institutions, can benefit from the so-called impact agenda there too. So what is impact? So impact, as we've already said, a buzzword, a fairly vague term. Broadly, and I know this will be bread and butter to quite a lot of people, any demonstrable contribution which research makes to society. There are two key definitions that kind of whiz around. Academic impact, so that's any contribution which research makes to an academic discourse. So that is researchers carrying out their research and that informing the way other researchers do their research. Just to use the word research as much as possible. Research. Impact, so research impact as the second bullet point, is what we'll be talking about today. And this is distinct because it refers to any benefits which research delivers beyond that academic discourse, including any social, economic, environmental changes driven and enabled by that research. So the impact we're talking about today isn't the way researchers inform their peers and the way research is carried out. it is all about the way their research findings are used or translated or applied in different contexts, hopefully to try and make the world a better place. The working definition that we use for impact at Coventry is the one that's drawn from REF 2021, and we'll talk a little bit more about REF and why it's so important to that field in a moment. But they define impact as an effect on, change, or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment, or quality of life beyond academia. Impact includes, but is not limited to, an effect on, change, or benefit to the activities or attitudes, awareness, behaviour, capacity, opportunity, performance, policy, practice, process, or understanding of any specific audience, beneficiary, community, constituency, organisation, association, or individuals in any geographic location. So whether that's locally for us in Coventry, whether that's regionally, whether that's nationally, internationally, or even beyond the world, if people want to have an impact on the space station or other planets per se. So really the kind of core of this definition is impact is any demonstrable benefit that we can link back to some research that was carried out by an academic. Within that, impact is kind of judged, the quality of impact is judged in slightly different ways. So the kind of two primary ways that we have of understanding the quality of impact, the quality that's perceived by researchers doing impact, is the reach, that refers to the extent of the change or benefit that's created by their work, and the significance, so the degree of that change or benefit. So, for example, if a researcher's carrying out work that informs productivity in factories, we would say that that impact had high reach if their research findings were used in hundreds of different factories across the UK. On the other hand, when we're thinking about significance, if a researcher is carrying out work and their findings are used by one company, but that really profoundly changes the way that company is doing something, it really has a real significant impact on them, we would say that has high significance. Most researchers are aiming for a mix of those two. So to have significant impact that is also wide-reaching. And things that we talk about as impact officers, as professionals supporting researchers, is thinking about how impacts can be scaled outwards or deepened. So if they are starting with some findings, how can we make sure those findings get the right kinds of people to make changes? And how can that roll on and on and on so the impact is broader and more significant for those people too? Introduced for the next REF, that again we're going to be talking about a little bit more later, is this concept of rigour. So this is a slightly grey area for impact professionals. We haven't been given full definitions by funding bodies, UKRI, Research England, anybody yet on what they mean by rigour. But broadly, rigour is about the approach taken in the delivery of that change or benefit, so the delivery of that impact. That might be things like the ethical considerations behind working with particular groups rather than other groups, the different kind of standards that inform the practice of working. So how you are going to interact with people, at what stages will you do that? And I think more broadly, it reflects this desire to see a kind of planned, joined up approach to impact where possible. People acknowledge that impact can happen serendipitously, so it can just happen by chance, by somebody external to a university seeing some research and thinking, oh, it'd be great if we could apply this in our own area. Things can happen like that, particularly when we're talking about policy citations and other kinds of impact in those areas, those kind of bigger areas. But REF and other bodies are increasingly looking to the methods researchers take to working with different stakeholders, engaging people who could possibly benefit from their research, and the way they're structuring that engagement too, which I think we can talk a little bit more about later. So pathways to impact is a really commonly used term within this area too. So in order for a researcher to achieve impact, so to achieve change as a result of whatever they found in their research, they will need to follow some kind of pathway. So we would say this always needs to start with research. Some research needs to be undertaken by a researcher that is new, that's innovative, that is theirs. They are creating findings, they are creating knowledge in that sense. That knowledge that they've created, those findings, need to be in some way disseminated, whether that's a one-on-one conversation with somebody, whether it's a presentation to a massive group of people, whether it's going on the TV or radio to talk about what their research is about, why it's important. Only when we see uptake following that dissemination, so only when somebody does something, when it becomes demonstrable that some change has happened as a result of the research being disseminated, can we refer to it as impact at the end of this process. So research impact really is that demonstrable change. If there is research impact, if that's being described, it should be easy for somebody to explain what research was at the back of this and what changed as a result of that research, that new knowledge coming to life. When we're talking to researchers about this, there's always a lot of confusion between impact, so research impact in these terms, and dissemination or public engagement. So the way you are sharing research or the way you're engaging with different communities or stakeholders to carry out this research. Both of these things are really important in achieving impact, in kind of developing these pathways to impact, but they are part of the process. They're not impact in of themselves. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about here, because often when we think about researchers engaging in different ways with different communities for their research, we're not necessarily thinking about what changes as a result of that. And sometimes frustrations can arise as part of this process too. Research impact is all about the change, a demonstrable change that's tangible and can in some way be evidenced at the end of this process. So, why is impact important? Why bother? Why bother in all of this? I think one of the key motivations, and something that I don't want to ignore here, is that many researchers are really motivated to see their research applied in the world beyond academia. They are passionate. Many researchers would regard themselves as activists, and they want to see their research do something, change something. They can really see where this fills a gap or provides a solution to a problem. By planning for impact, engaging stakeholders effectively and capturing the evidence of that impact, academics can develop skills, build useful relationships with different people beyond academia, and assess whether their intended outcomes have actually been achieved. So thinking about research impact can really prompt reflection on the effectiveness of scholarly approaches to societal change and benefit. Often people groan when they're asked to talk about impact. The impact agenda is something that has, to some extent, been forced onto people for different reasons by funding bodies and by other groups. But at the core of it, within this expectation, is wanting research to do change and wanting to understand what change is brought about as a result of that research. If researchers embrace this drive for impact, they are opening themselves up to lots of different funding sources, lots of different approaches to engaging with different groups that maybe didn't exist before. It's really formalizing a process that previously researchers kind of carried out anyway. One of the big reasons people are interested in impact, and I think probably fair to say the reason why our team at Coventry are employed, is because impact often represents institutional good news. So impact is often used as a source of good news for higher education institutions, demonstrating research undertaken delivers a benefit at local, national, and international levels. Examples of impact help universities show they're respecting their civic responsibilities, serving those beyond the ivory tower. So I think impact can be really important from a kind of ops perspective, letting people see really that research that's being carried out is changing things and it is useful in some tangible sense. Funding proposals is a massive one. Any researchers on the line will kind of nod along with this. All funders ask for impact plans in some way or the other, even if that is just part of a professional development plan for academics. So those impact plans are within applications. Funders often want academics to report on the success of these plans in final or interim reports. Therefore, planning for, capturing and evidencing research impact can enhance the transparency and accountability of research projects, really enabling academics to provide tangible evidence of the value and societal relevance of their work too. Important to say as well, demonstrating this kind of research impact, so what changes as a result of any research that's carried out, can also really strengthen public trust and support for research more widely. Funders vary on the emphasis they place on impact, but for the majority, there is an expectation that impact is incorporated into project proposals. But what does this actually look like? I mean, when we say impact needs to be in a project proposal, what do we mean? Some proposals might have specific sections where you articulate the changes that you intend to create through your research. Others may expect those notes on changes, those notes on impact, to be interwoven into the main proposal. Funders want to feel confident that the research they're funding will have a clear legacy of some kind, and delivering benefits beyond academia can be a real big part of this. They expect to see impact demonstrated in applications through defining the needs. So, why is this important? What could this research change for society? Designing the project, who are we going to involve in this to try and make sure these changes actually happen? And also helping to ensure project findings then go on to inform things like practice or policy. What routes could be taken to make sure that this research isn't just done, written up into a book and put on a shelf, hidden forever. A big one here, and we've already mentioned it, is the REF. So the REF is the Research Excellence Framework. It's an exercise undertaken roughly every 7 to 8 years, attempting to assess the quality of research at different UK universities and higher education institutions. The outcomes of REF are used to inform the allocation of around £2 billion of public funding for universities' research per year. So a big chunk of money for institutions. The way REF works is it looks at submissions made by a university under these three categories. So on people, culture and environment, so what kind of environment the university is creating to kind of serve research. Contribution to knowledge and understanding, which is really what kind of academic articles, books, journals, other kinds of output, so demonstrations of that research are being put out into the world by researchers. And then finally, it's assessing engagement and impact, really important for us in this presentation today. So how do they do this? How do they understand what impact the universities have been having? The way they do this is through impact case studies. Impact case studies are really short, 5-page documents that universities kind of submit in multiple numbers depending on how many people are employed at the university and what disciplinary areas they work within. Roughly a kind of highest standard impact case study submitted to the REF could be worth about £200,000 per year to an institution. And you can see that once we're working with kind of multiples of these, maybe 5 in each different disciplinary area, the value of creating good impact case studies should be quite obvious. They're really basic, simple documents, thinking about really in kind of headline terms, what's changed as a result of research, a body of research that's been carried out by an institution, what research has gone into creating that change. What's the story behind the impact? Who have you worked with? What kind of stakeholders have you engaged? What have you created to try and enable change as a result of this work happening? And then really importantly, what evidence do you have to show that? What sources to corroborate the impact can you show us? When REF are talking about impact, as we've said already, they are using very broad terms. Impact can cover things like understanding, learning and participation, how research is informing all of those things, creativity, culture and society, social welfare, commerce and the economy, public policy, law and services, health, well-being and animal welfare, production, environment, practitioners and professional services. broadly, if research has led to any kind of beneficial change for anyone in the world over the ref period, it's something that is worthy of talking about in an impact case study. Though these impact case studies, because of their limited number, are supposed to be the kind of flagship examples for a university, the best kinds of impact they've had from different areas of research that their researchers, their academics are carrying out. And you can see here we have lots of different examples of the kind of evidence that REF and other bodies are interested in. And we'll be able to circulate these slides afterwards. But I think as we're kind of coming to it, we need to see that this kind of evidence collection, this kind of work, doesn't need to just be for the purposes of the REF. The REF is a kind of analysis. It's a kind of review that takes place every 7 to 8 years. It's trying to understand what has come about as a result of research and what evidence has been collected to kind of prove that this has happened and prove the kind of nature of these changes that have happened. But really, I think there is an expectation when working with stakeholders from across the board, not only in universities, to understand, evaluate, analyse what has changed after a project has happened. What difference has that project made? Really giving you space to reflect on it, provide evidence for it as a way of moving forward and developing future work together. If you're interested in looking at impact case studies, almost all of them are generally available, except for those that contain sensitive information for various reasons. The links through here you can follow to the REF 2021 Impact Case Study database. And it's, I mean, very boring to get excited about a database, but it's really user-friendly. You can search it by keywords if you're interested to see which impact case studies were submitted by which institutions, what different individual academics did, what different stakeholders might have been involved in research that led to changes, and really how people went about creating change. Really, in some cases, quite impressive change through research that was carried out at their institutions too. So I feel like that part of the presentation was really thinking about what impact is and why researchers are interested in it for various reasons. But really importantly, and kind of coming to the midway point of this session, what can that mean for HDRC stakeholders? So when we're talking to when we're talking to researchers about impact, often one of the first things we ask them to do is think about their impact goals. So trying to identify what changes they want to create through their research. We're asking them things like, what central problem is your research trying to solve? Who or what would you like to benefit from this in the short, medium and long terms? Which key stakeholders could you work with or reach out to help realise these impacts or these changes? And then ultimately, what story do you want to tell about the impact of your research? What's that kind of central narrative that's driving you in all of the work that you're doing? When we're thinking about impact goals, it's really useful to separate into short-term, mid-term and long-term. By short-term goals, we mean what could research change maybe within the life cycle of a project. So that might be somewhere between 1 and 5 years. If we're thinking about change created by research, often that in that kind of time period would be fairly small things that seem minor. So changes in understanding or confidence or capacity for quite a limited group of people. These might be achievable goals, so demonstrable changes for project participants or stakeholders. And I think it's really useful to kind of think in those terms. Impact case studies from the REF will talk about really impressive, big, amazing impacts that are kind of showcases for a university. But everybody needs to start with thinking about, in the short term, what they're trying to do and for which people. The trick really here is to consider how those short-term impact goals can be sustained to reach the midterm. So what the research might change in the few years following a project end, changes that could consolidate and develop those made in the short term, part of the pathways to building towards longer term goals. And then finally, by long-term impacts, we are talking often things that happen 20 years and more after a project has ended, after a number of projects have ended for a researcher. We're asking a researcher to kind of drive the impact journey here. So thinking about what motivates them in terms of societal changes, what they are doing their research for, what problems they are trying to solve that can be applied outside of that kind of academic discourse. So these might be the headline changes that could be the culmination of numerous projects, thinking big. It could be things like a change in a series of policies or change in practice for many different people, nationally or internationally applied. UN Sustainable Development Goals are often used in these conversations about long-term impacts. We're asking researchers to think about potential beneficiaries of their research as a way to begin approaching these goals, because the change doesn't happen without other people getting involved. Who could benefit from the changes you want to bring about with your research? How would they benefit? And in tandem, which stakeholders could be involved in helping to facilitate these impact goals? Who can help use your research to deliver change, and how can they be brought in, whether that's through a project or activity or some other kind of exercise? Again, thinking about all of these questions, who could benefit? What are their specific needs? How can these benefits be delivered? Where can you look for stakeholders? Why should they engage with you? And why would you engage with these stakeholders? Hopefully it's clear from all of these points that we're really prompting researchers to try and think not only about what they want, but how they can come to understand what people external to universities want themselves, and how that can come together in a conversation to help build relationships that are useful and kind of sustain mutual goals, both for stakeholders beyond universities and for researchers themselves. We're really asking, why? Why should they engage with you? Why would they want to do this? What stake do they have in it? And personal relationships go so far with this, but allowing people to understand what a researcher's impact goals are and how they might align with an organisation's goals or a council's goals could be really beneficial in terms of enabling longer term relationships and communication. From a researcher perspective, and through an impact lens, stakeholder engagement can refer to any form of interaction between a researcher and those with a stake in harnessing the potential application of that research. Delivering impact from research is often a really lengthy process and quite difficult to accomplish as a lone researcher. People will often ask us how they could have time to do this, how they can have time to make the changes they want to make with their research. One of the things that we often suggest is that building effective relationships with stakeholders can really help share the load in achieving that impact, really looking to achieving mutual goals here. Stakeholders can support the process and really act as advocates for use of research, if it's useful to them, following project end. Researchers shouldn't have to push for their research to be used all the time. By building effective relationships with stakeholders and understanding what their particular needs are, those stakeholders can then become the people using that research naturally and advocating for its use further, acting as kind of models for the use of that research too. So I think coming back to really stakeholder engagement, identification of these impact goals doesn't have to be carried out by researchers in isolation. And this is something that's an increasing focus, a kind of mantra amongst research impact professionals. Academics are increasingly advised to discuss goals with stakeholders from outside of academia to make sure they align with the wants and needs of the people they are working with, or ultimately the people they are trying to create benefit for. If you were a researcher and you're trying to create a positive change in a certain way, it can really help to make sure that you've understood properly from the person you're trying to create benefit for, whether this really is a problem for them or whether there should be a slightly different focus here. HDRC stakeholders who want to work with researchers have the opportunity to help co-develop these goals, contribute to plans, and create a shared approach. it's usually in the hands of the researcher if they're designing a project to reach out. But I think part of the purpose of this presentation is to share more understanding of all of the different things a researcher will be thinking about in relation to trying to create this research impact. And I think as a stakeholder, there is an opportunity there to really help guide what's happening in a project, what changes can be created, what resources are put into different areas, because that any stakeholder will have their own expertise, their own real energy and kind of power in that space to understand what they need and why they need it, and how maybe a researcher might slightly change their approach to kind of help fulfill some of those needs. It struck me talking in this session about health determinants research collaborations that lots of the talk is about embedding a culture of using evidence when making decisions within local government. They use words like research findings to understand how decisions impact on health and health inequalities, carrying out research where evidence isn't already available. This allied so nicely with a university's impact agenda. So researchers there trying to make sure their research is being used, being applied in ways to have some kind of purpose and use to be translated for those purposes. And I think having more knowledge about how both sides are working, and really from this presentation, what researchers are thinking about in their approach to impact, can help everybody in this process. So one of the big things that we encourage researchers to think about is co-creating their research, which I don't think is a particularly new concept to anybody here. But this is about involving stakeholders early in the design of research projects to help enrich the project through knowledge and perspectives they can bring, ensure impact plans and pathways are fit to purpose, as we've already said, and encourage that their sustained participation during the project itself. A big part of this is fostering trust and cooperation through mutual understanding. So to understand a researcher's impact goals and really what's motivating them to carry out research and try and apply it in this way can help with that approach. Again, one of the biggest things that stakeholders can do that researchers might not be able to do is help promote post-project advocacy of research findings. So if you as a stakeholder really see value in findings, you want to take them up, you want to encourage other people to use them because you've helped co-create those findings and because you see them as particularly relevant to your field, you're in a position where you can act as that advocate in a way that as a researcher slightly removed from that kind of setting wouldn't necessarily be able to do. And I've just added some tools and resources that we often suggest to people here. So once we get down to the kind of brass tacks of this, it's creating space for those initial conversations about impact goals and how those can be shared goals, mutual goals, mutually beneficial to both researchers and to non-academic stakeholders. But when we're thinking about how that comes into a project, it's thinking about the researcher time, the stakeholder time that goes into that project, the resources that will be needed and the infrastructure, how we can cover that with funding within project spend, the different activities that are going to happen within that project. So how co-creation can work within that, how different research can go on, how engagement with users or beneficiaries can happen to make sure that the findings that are created are useful, do have that kind of use. The outputs that are created are a really important thing. So often we talk about outputs with academics and they assume that we're referring to books or academic publications. But really, we're encouraging researchers to think about their audience in all of this. If they're trying to create a change for a particular group of people or an organization, what is it that that group of people or organization read or otherwise engage with? And how can you frame the findings of your research to make sure it fits with that audience's needs? So things like different media sources, workshops, policy briefings, videos, other presentations. And I think really external stakeholders, so non-academics, can play a really massive role in helping inform what these outputs to look like, how they can be up to date and useful to the audience they're really trying to do things for. And then ultimately, as we've said already, thinking about those short-term impacts, thinking about really what a researcher wants from the end of a project and what stakeholders want, as a direct outcome. What would you be disappointed about if it didn't happen by the end of a collaboration, by the end of an engagement with a researcher? And finally, that broader vision, what are we trying to do here? What are we motivated by? Is it something like increased societal well-being? Is it something to do with reducing inequality or creating more sustainable livelihoods? But sharing these timelines, sharing the milestones, sharing this kind of information can be really beneficial to creating that shared understanding of change that's trying to be created here. I think just as a kind of end point, because I know time's moving on here now too, evidence is a really important part of this impact agenda. So it's no longer enough for researchers to carry out research and believe that it is doing something good in terms of impact. So if they're looking to use impact in future funding bids or in a ref case study, or even to invigorate their future research, communicating or even co-developing impact plans before or early on in a project can really help researchers identify sources of evidence to collect by project end. And this evidence can be really useful because it can help understanding of whether something has worked or hasn't worked, whether approach needs to be changed or not changed. When we're talking about evidence of impact, often it's fairly loose. So it could be things like testimonials from relevant parties, so people who they are trying to create benefit for through their work, or from other stakeholders they've worked with who might be able to observe changes that are happening in front of them. It could be things like quantitative data collection. So how can the research be linked to changes that you see in data that is being collected anyway, or anything else, as long as it shows that nature of change. What we encourage researchers to do is be upfront with the evidence everybody would like to see and try to establish what changes everybody working together, including non-academic stakeholders, would like to see realised by the end of a project. Both researchers and stakeholders really commit time and potentially resources to a project, so understanding the impact of the research can be really mutually beneficial there, just as a motivation to understand why we should keep investing money in this area, or what should be done slightly differently next time to make sure things are achieved in the way they're hoped for. Capturing impact evidence means identifying and recording information about the difference that the research has made, what has changed as a result of the research, and how that change can be partially or slightly less often wholly attributed to that research. A researcher will want to know this because it can really help them win funding in the future and carry out similar work or similar activity. Often it can feel too early to collect that evidence of impact as things are waiting to develop. If people aren't careful, however, it can quickly prove too late, with staff moving on, organisations changing focus to a new project, or relationships changing. Capturing impact, therefore, should ideally be an ongoing process that doesn't just happen at the end of an activity, the end of an engagement, the end of a project, but should happen throughout a research project, because then the results of it can help enrich the research project as it moves forward. So I feel like I've talked for far too long, but really in summary, I wanted to get over here that the impact agenda can be seen as an administrative burden by some researchers, but many see the value in understanding the change their research makes to society, can be brought on board with that side of impact. Understanding the language of research impacts and the potential for funded activity linked to it, because there is money attached to impact in a greater or lesser sense, can represent opportunities for individuals, groups and organisations outside of the HE sector. Everybody is looking for the benefits that can come from the application of research in real-world settings. Non-academic stakeholders can play a bigger role in helping shape research impact and sharing the process of planning for, delivering and evaluating change, really in pursuit of those common goals. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my